to the What Really Happened radio show. Because World War III is a really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Friday, April 5th, 2013, getting into the month of April. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday, and so forth and so on. Pauhana Friday, heading into the weekend here. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Sam is in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phones when you call on in. And, of course, the lovely Lady Claire will be joining us in hour number 3 of the show today to share her unique perspective on what's going on in the world. A lot of stuff going on here. And last night, after I had gone off the air, we started seeing some interesting stories hit the corporate media. CNN came out with a headline saying, U.S. reducing rhetoric that feeds North Korean belligerence. And the article basically goes on to say, well, maybe it was the U.S., rattling their sabers and sanctions and putting warships off the coast of North Korea that was inflaming the situation. Gee, you think? And this was followed up by another story picked up over at rawstory.com. U.S. official, we are not on the brink of war with North Korea. Now, this doesn't mean we can relax. What this means is the government has been running internal polling, and it's coming back with most Americans saying, no, we do not want a new war. We don't want to go into Korea. And we see the United States government as having precipitated the situation. Now, what do I mean by internal polls? For those of you who are not familiar with the concept, there are two kinds of polls that are being conducted. There are the internal polls where they go out and try and find out what Americans are actually thinking. Those are rarely, if ever, released to the public or released to the media. Then there are the external polls, which are the push polls and biased questions. These are the ones that are intended to create the illusion of public support for whatever the given agenda happens to be. So that's what I mean by internal polls. From this sudden pulling back on the rhetoric, it looks like the U.S. government realizes most Americans are seeing this as just another in a long chain of war creation out of thin air, poking somebody until they poke back and then say, aha, they poked us. And I think that's the reason for the change in tone. I don't think it means that the agenda for war with North Korea is off. They're still flogging it in the corporate media. And remember, the real agenda here is to get into some kind of a conflict with China to politically and, most importantly, economically isolate them. But if you go back and you look at the news coverage we've been seeing, this is obviously being ginned up from our side. And going back, we're seeing the same long train of news stories that we saw relative to Iraq, and we are currently seeing relative to Iran. Back in 2006, Israel demands world respond decisively to North Korean nuclear test, which is interesting because I think we can't rule out the possibility that Israel sold North Korea those nuclear weapons. Then in 2008, Haaretz was back there saying North Korea supplying weapons to 6 Mideast states. That, of course, turned out to be completely false. 2010, Israel saying North Korea shipping weapons of mass destruction to Syria. And then in 2012, in Arutz Sheva, North Korea's enemy, Israel. 2013, the Jewish Virtual Library, potential threats to Israel, North Korea. Then in 2013, this was in the Huffington Post, Israel minister, Iran, Syria, and North Korea are new axis of evil. So once again, we're seeing it's all coming out of Israel and the Israel media saying, oh, yes, they're bad, they're evil, you should go kill them for us. And I don't think so. All right, we got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the situation in Korea. The United States is clearly toning down its rhetoric. But we're still seeing this being fanned on the media. North Korea is a danger. North Korea is a danger. And so I think the circumstance is, again, the internal polling came back. Most Americans seeing the United States as trying to generate this war. And so now the U.S. government is trying to back down. They still want the war, but they're at a loss on how to figure out how to make it look like it's the other guy's fault. They made us invade North Korea, Mommy. We were trying to be good. It's all their fault. Now, over at the Langley Intelligence Group Network, they're taking a slightly different tone. Their opinion is that the United States government has severely miscalculated relative to North Korea, which, yes, that is pretty much obvious. Their take is the U.S. government is now trying to find a face-saving way to extract from this current public relations nightmare. And whether or not they can preserve the rush to war, which doesn't really exist in the American people anyway, remains to be seen. But obviously this has been a major foreign policy stumble, and of course with the U.S. backing off, Kim Jong-un is going to be out there proclaiming to his own people, I back down the mighty American empire, which of course is not going to help the situation at all. But Kim Jong-un is facing issues within his own government. They still have terrible problems over there, and Kim Jong-un would love a foreign enemy that he could use to scare everybody into going along with the current conditions of life over there, much as the United States has been using Al-Qaeda. Yes, times are hard, but it's all the fault of Al-Qaeda. Go hate them for 2 minutes, so forth and so on. We are on the corporate media, however, seeing all of these videos about North Korean soldiers training and learning how to shoot guns, which is, yeah, that's what the military does. They train, they learn how to shoot guns and put very large holes in other people's property, including their bodies. But they're fanning it up there, and they're still trying to make it look like this is all North Korea's fault. And again, based on the backing down by the U.S. government, obviously they are not succeeding. North Korea has actually warned the embassies that they might want to think about getting out. And this is being spun as, oh, North Korea's belligerents, they're threatening our embassies. No, what North Korea is actually saying is, we think the Americans might attack us, and you might be in the way. So you might want to think about maybe being someplace away from the flying shrapnel, which is certainly a very reasonable thing to do. Now, the corporate media is making a big deal over the fact that North Korea has moved 2 of their medium-range missiles closer to the East Coast. And there was actually this headline. This is over in the Independent in Great Britain. Pyongyang moves missiles onto coast, prompting fears of imminent attack. It's all their fault. They're being belligerent. Well, let's be honest. If you are a small country and a fleet of warships, stealth bombers, B-52s, asphyxiation fighters, and the rest of that hardware started flying around your borders and acting like they were about ready to attack, you might want to move some of your military hardware. The reality is we're talking about 2 of these medium-range missiles. If North Korea were really planning an imminent attack, they would be moving all of their missiles. It looks to me that North Korea is going to have a live-fire exercise with these 2 missiles as kind of a way of sending a message. We've got the bugs out. These rockets will fly out and hit what they're supposed to hit. And I don't see that as a provocation. I think it's North Korea trying to say, this is not going to be as easy as you think it is. And so Kim Jong-un, or at least his military high command, may have realized that the situation has, in fact, gone too far, and they want to back down. I don't think there's anybody in North Korea's government or military command who seriously thinks they can hold off an American military strike. And so I think they were counting on the war-weary American people, and so far, again, given the back-down in rhetoric on the part of the U.S. government, he may have guessed right on that one. Now, moving over to other parts of the world, of course, we're still looking at Italy's political turmoil following their recent elections in which no one party had a clear majority and mandate to form a government. So former Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi is trying to form a new coalition government out of all these disparate parties. And failing that is saying it's time for a second election. And this feels to me like a replay of what we saw in Greece, where the anti-banker, anti-bailout party won the election. And the pro-bankers simply stamped their feet, threw tantrums, and refused to form a coalition government to force a second election that was marked by rampant and obvious vote fraud to put the bankers into power. And, of course, we have seen what's happened to Greece economically since then. It looks like they're getting ready to try the same thing in Italy. Now, down in Israel, the representatives of IHH, the International Humanitarian Organization that organized that aid flotilla in 2010 that Israel attacked, have basically come out with a statement. The families of all those people who were murdered by the IDF are not impressed by Israel's apology, mostly because it went to the government of Turkey rather than the families. And, of course, there was no apology to the United States for the American citizen who was gunned down. Well, actually, he was already down. He was lying on the deck, already under control, already helpless, and they caught it on video that the IDF was not able to find and confiscate, and they just pumped bullets into his skull. And so they're not at all impressed with Israel's apology, and they're saying basically the only meaningful sign of contrition on the part of Israel would be to lift the Gaza blockade, and they're absolutely right. Because Israel continues to do what Israel wants to do, and they're not changing their behavior, but they're going to scream and yell, oh, you shouldn't talk about it. You shouldn't criticize us. Sounds a lot like the Catholic Church want to go on molesting the little kiddies. And they're not upset about that, but they're out there screaming at anybody who talks about it, saying, you can't say that. You're anti-God. You're damaging the reputation of the church. Actually, no. The priests who are messing with the little kiddies are damaging the reputation of the church. And if you want people to not talk about these things, you fix the problem. You just don't go around slapping up at people who are talking about it. And the same is true, of course, for Israel. If the world's Jewish people do not want Israel to be criticized any longer, the correct course of action is to tell Israel not to do things that are deserving of criticism. Meanwhile, here in the United States of America, there's a conservative American Jewish group, and they opposed Barack Obama in 2012. They were together with Netanyahu, making commercials and everything. They have sent an open letter to Benjamin Netanyahu, urging him to ignore the advice of certain American Jewish leaders who are saying Israel has to take concrete steps to restart the peace talks with Palestine. And so this other group is saying, no land for peace, to go in there and just take it all that belongs to Israel, which is easy for this group to say. They're safely in America. They're not afraid of getting caught in the crossfire, so it's easy for them to sit on the other side of the planet and say, yes, Israel should be tough with Palestine. If they really meant what they said, they'd be on their way over to Israel right now with their own baggy green outfits and their M16s. And I'm getting sick and tired of all these people who are on this side of the planet saying war in the Mideast is a great thing as long as your children go. And some of the propaganda is getting a little bit out there. Over at dailycaller.com, there's an article. FDR failed to save more Jews during the Holocaust because of his vision of what America should look like. And they go on and on about how he just didn't, FDR was an anti-Semite, FDR was an anti-Semite, FDR, going on that whole thing. Now, I have a comment about that. Regardless of how you feel about his performance in office, it is undeniable that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president of the United States of America, not of Judea. And as President of the United States, Roosevelt had no legal authority or even a moral obligation to divert the resources of the United States of America to save a specific foreign people who over the last 2,000 years can't seem to stay out of trouble and then scream for somebody else to come in and save them. Now, the fact is that this nation, the United States, sacrificed much blood and treasure to stop the Nazis from doing whatever it is they were really doing. And ever since then, all we hear from Israel is, you didn't do enough, you didn't do enough, you didn't do enough, you didn't do enough. How much sharper than a serpent's tooth to have a thankless child. And now, of course, we're getting this attempt to say, oh, Roosevelt was an anti-Semite. And you need to really step back and look at the sheer arrogance of that, as if the entire world is somehow responsible for Israel. Now, Israel was founded as an independent state for the safety and security of the world's Jewish people, and that's a noble ideal. But with Israel constantly looting the rest of the planet for wealth, and Israel constantly demanding other nations fight their wars for them, Israel can't be seen as independent by any reasonable definition of the word. And Israel's government's actions are making the world far more dangerous for the world's Jewish people. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsor. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, speaking of Israel just doing what it wants to do, but you're an anti-Semite if you talk about it, earlier this week, the Egyptian Navy intercepted a cargo ship on its way out of the Israeli port of Eilat. And originally they said it was on its way to Syria. Then later it came out it was on its way to Togo in West Africa, and the ship was filled with weapons. It was an arms ship. And they grabbed it. Israel, of course, as of today, is denying it has anything to do with this ship full of weapons. And in fact, even initially tried to deny it had come out of the port of Eilat. But apparently the Egyptians did document where the ship was coming from. So we're back to this whole thing. Let's send weapons. Let's start a war. Let's make money off this thing. So they're out there just, oh, you're anti-Semites. Only anti-Semites would say that we're sending weapons, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, Israeli weapons keep turning up in Syria in the hands of the hired mercenary army. So it's just more of this warmongering to serve the bankers, because the bankers are getting rich off of this stuff. Now, here's an interesting little story, and I think it indicates how the world really has had it with Israel's arrogant attitude of going into everybody else's country and say, you will do this and you will do that. Over in France, there was an incident not too long ago where Air France, at the request of the Israeli government, were interrogating non-Jewish passengers on flights from France to Israel to interrogate whether they were Jewish or not. And there was a big stink where a Palestinian activist was on the plane flying there, and she was thrown off. Well, the government of France has now fined Air France for doing this, for what amounts to basically racist interrogation. Are you black? You use that door. Are you white? You use that door. If you're Israeli, you get first class, and if you're Palestinian, we're just going to duct tape you to the wing. And the French government came down hard on Air France, and maybe Air France will start thinking a little more seriously every time a foreign government calls them up and says, please harass your passengers on our behalf. Now, interesting little story, because we know that the next time Israel starts invading, they're going to go in several directions. We're seeing indications they want to go further into the Golan. They're certainly making all kinds of stink face about going into the Sinai for a security buffer zone. And I think that was the reason this arms ship was originally thought to be going to the Sinai, is to arm up more people in that area. And, of course, Lebanon. Israel's last invasion of Lebanon did not achieve its strategic aim of taking control of the Litani River. And Israel's been making all this, well, Israel's overflying Lebanon, violation of their sovereign airspace. And they're going on up in there, and their propaganda is coming out. And I want to remind everybody, that Israel is portraying Iran as this threat to the Jewish people of the world. And it turns out that Iran is actually a very comfortable place for Jewish people, because Israel tried to offer them financial rewards to emigrate to Israel, and the Iranian Jews said, no, we got good lives here. We got businesses, we're comfortable, nobody harasses us, there's religious freedom. And so that propaganda fell apart. More recently, Israel's been screaming about how Christians are being abused and tortured inside Lebanon. And this story came out of The Ugly Truth, basically saying that, in point of fact, Lebanese Christians are saying they're respected, they have stable lives, they are not being harassed by Hezbollah, and they just wish they could live their lives in peace. Meanwhile, we're continuing to get stories from Christians living inside Israel that life is not too cozy. Apparently, it's sort of a social custom there that they get spit on all the time. But Israel's out there saying, oh, Iran's the problem, Lebanon's the problem, and so forth and so on here. Now, getting over to Iran, they're about ready to crank up the latest chapter in the P5+1 talks. We know the United States is going to do everything they can to derail it. They don't want a diplomatic solution. The goal is to find some excuse to invade and conquer Iran and shackle their oil to the U.S. dollar. Same motivation, primary motivation for the invasion of Iraq, primary motivation for the invasion of Libya, primary motivation for the invasion of, well, just pick a name. So basically, we're seeing this report out of almonitor.com, bipartisan report recommending some Iran sanctions relief. And the gist of the report is that it's time to lift some of these sanctions on Iran as a gesture of goodwill toward resolving this crisis without going to military action. And it's a significant change from the U.S.-backed position, which is that Iran has to do everything demanded of it first, and then maybe the sanctions will be lifted. And, of course, that's a negotiating position that's designed to fail. So already we're seeing people coming out of, like, the Iran Task Force or the Atlantic Council is saying it's time for everybody to give a little to solve this diplomatically. The U.S. will never let it happen, but obviously the political support to force this through to a war is starting to erode. We will be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. There's a very interesting story, and this came out of imgur.com. Actually, it was just a picture, and the headline was, I'm an active duty Marine, and this is an example of the stupid excrement I have to deal with on a daily basis, and it's basically a picture of a bumper sticker that says, my daddy kills bad people for Jesus. Can't Jesus kill his own bad guys? And every time I see somebody talking about a holy crusade or killing for God or whatever, the first thing I ask is, you know, you claim your God created the entire universe and is the cause of volcanoes and earthquakes and tempests and typhoons. Can't he do his own killing? Why does he need me to do it for him? Especially since it violates one of those 10 rules we're all supposed to be following. And it's just another example of how religion is being used to make mind slaves of people, to send them out to go kill on command and grab that other nation's wealth and bring it back to your nation's rulers in exchange for wings and a harp should you not survive the trip. All right, we're going to talk about the economy. Obviously, this is big news here. The U.S. jobs gain for March was the lowest in 10 months. Now, the government is still out there trying to claim that the unemployment number went down. And obviously, the two don't reconcile until you realize that we're dealing with an additional section of the population that has fallen off the end of the system. Their benefits have run out. They're no longer actively seeking work through the government offices that keep track of this. And that's the real reality. We're looking at something like 90 million Americans out of the labor force. And I know I got an email from somebody saying, well, 90 million, yeah, that's pretty serious. But when you look at the whole population of the United States, $330 million, it's 30%, and that's bad. But it's not a disaster. Well, it's worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s. And you need to remember that entire population of the United States of 330 million includes little tiny children who are too young to work. And it includes really old people who are too old to work. Even if they understand they can't really retire, they still are physically unable to work. So when you're talking about the available labor force, and 90 million of those are not working, that percentage of joblessness gets up over that 40% mark again. And that is really, really bad. So the new job creation plunged to just 88,000, way below the absolute worst case prediction that the economists were saying it might be. The job participation rate in this country is at a new 30-year low. That's it. We have more jobless in this country than we've had at any time in the last 30 years. For some of you listening to this show, that means before you were born. And the fingers are pointing and the excuses are being written, and nobody really wants to deal with the underlying cause of this economic crash, which is private central banks issuing the public currency as a loan at interest that cannot help but simply pile up artificially created imaginary debt until the system collapses. So apparently, again, we've had people not in the labor force soared by 663,000. And we're basically back at labor force participation rates last seen in 1979. I have trouble remembering 1979. I think I was working on Star Trek: The Motion Picture back then. So poverty rates are spiking in this country back to 1960s level when the country was being impoverished by the war in Vietnam. 50 million Americans are below the poverty line. Child hunger rates are amazingly high. And, of course, the federal government they're cutting off all the programs. Oh, sequestration. We can't take care of our people. We need the money for war, and we need the money for Wall Street, and we need the money for Israel. And so looking at this article over at Investment Watch blog, they're asking the question, does that mean there's no way out? Yes, that is exactly what it means. There is no way out of this mess until somebody has the courage to stand up and point the finger at private central banks issuing the public currency as a loan at interest. Until they're willing to deal with that as the root cause of the destruction of our nation and its economy, the problem won't be fixed. Anything that they're doing that does not address that issue is purely propaganda for public consumption. It's like I used to say about the Eurozone and the boat with 10 holes in the bottom and 9 corks. And all they can do is pull a cork out of one hole, shove it into another hole, say, I'm working on the problem, but the water still comes in and the ship is still going to sink. There is one and only one way to save the United States of America, and that is the Andrew Jackson option. You shut that private central bank down, and you go back to the Lincoln and Kennedy formulas. The government issues its own currency, spends it into circulation to buy what the government needs. It flows through society, fueling commerce without accruing interest to a private banker, and is taxed back at the end of the cycle to balance the books. There is no legitimate reason for us to be enslaved to the bankers. If the government can print a $1 treasury bond to give to the bankers, to give to the Federal Reserve, they can print a dollar bill to put in circulation. And we understand why politicians are reluctant to do that. People who stand up to those bankers, they get shot at. Kennedy got shot, Lincoln got shot, Andrew Jackson got shot at. Actually, not even really that. He had guns pointed at him and the triggers pulled, but they didn't fire. That is the root cause of all these problems, not just in the United States of America, all across Europe. Every nation enslaved to a private central bank issuing the public currency as a loan at interest is drowning in this artificially created imaginary debt. And I emphasize imaginary because all these trillions of dollars and trillions of euros that are supposedly owed to these bankers never existed to begin with. It's all made up, and it works only so long as you believe that this is the way the system is supposed to be. Because you've been brainwashed in your public education that reserve banking is the way to go. And they don't even tell you that the United States fought a revolution to break free of this exact same style of banking. And you and your ancestors were sold back into the slavery of these private bankers by a corrupt Congress and a corrupt president. And the fact that Woodrow Wilson sort of apologized for it in his diary a few years later doesn't change the reality. He wanted to be president. He wanted that Oval Office, and he was willing to do anything to get it, including promising to the bankers that he would sign the Federal Reserve Act. Now, over at wallstreetpit.com, there's an interesting story about Fed leaders try head fake distraction from never-ending quantitative easing. Remember when quantitative easing, long ago in those innocent times, was going to be a temporary measure? We've got to do it now. It's a temporary measure. Then we got to come back and do it again. Then we got to come back and do it again. And now, of course, Wall Street is hooked on it. They can't stop the quantitative easing or the whole system comes crashing down. And the Fed is trying to say, well, we got to tone it down, and they've already said that a couple of times over the last couple of months, but the instant they slow it down, the whole system starts to lock up. The whole U.S. economy is being supported by those printing presses and computer terminals. And the only reason we are not seeing the inflationary pressures at the consumer level is because most of that instantly created money is going to the money junkies. The Federal Reserve is the currency source, and the 1% are the currency sink. And it's going from the Federal Reserve into the big bankers, and from the big bankers into the big bankers' pockets. And when they can't keep up that operation any longer, that's when we're going to see Weimar-style hyperinflation. Zimbabwe-style inflation hit the United States of America. It says right here on this little piece of paper, very pretty printed piece of paper from Zimbabwe, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. That's your first warning. And its face value is $100 trillion. Right there. I could pay off the national debt with this thing. So it's all by guess and by gosh, and it's all lies and fraud and illusion. And interesting story that came out of King World News is Jim Sinclair is warning we're on the verge of the mother of all financial crises. And he's absolutely right, because globalism means that all of these private central banks are going to crash at the same time. This is a good thing, because when we pick up the pieces and move forward, you're going to see every country on earth saying no more of these private central banks. They are a disaster. It is a failed social experiment, and it's time to end. Sinclair also went on to make the statement, the plunge protection team is not a speculation. There is a group of advisors to the White House that deals with the markets. They also gather when markets are in extreme conditions. So to be clear, there is an organization which is designed to intervene in the markets. Of course, we've been saying this since back during the Clinton years when the PPT was first put together. So they could run up the stock market and use it as a political banner. It's the economy, stupid. We're good for the economy. Look at my federal budget surplus. Which you got by looting Social Security. And it's a confirmation of what we've been saying all along. The government is dicking with the markets for political and financial reasons. And like the quantitative easing, they're trapped now. They have to keep rigging the market, because those Wall Street investment firms and banks that were buying huge blocks of stock to create an artificial demand and run the prices up, those blocks of stock are now on their balance sheets. In a major market downturn, virtually every Wall Street firm is going to be instantly insolvent. So they're going to do whatever they need to keep it propped up. High-frequency trading, direct intervention. They may even start hacking the Wall Street computers. They're that desperate here. Now, they're not having such a good day today. The markets were down pretty much all over the world. The PPT is definitely at work in the American markets. They're massaging the stock market, trying to get the traditional Friday happy ending. And it's a race. They may get it there, they may not. But I don't think it's going to fool anybody, even if it ends a few points in the green on Friday, that they're going to forget that roller coaster that we've had for the last couple of days. And on top of all that, of course, this is from the Trenches World Report. Obama is back to trying to seek some kind of a deficit reduction deal with Congress. Number one on his list, cuts to Social Security. And this is a repeat of what we've been seeing all along. The government is taking your money that you pay for things like road, schools, hospitals, and, of course, your retirement. And they're spending it someplace else. That money in Social Security is not the government's money. It is a separate deduction from every paycheck you've ever been given. A little tiny window with a tiny amount in there. That's your money. It's not the government's money. It's not their discretionary spending. That's your money that you foolishly, in hindsight, trusted the government to take care of for you. And starting with the Clinton administration, the administration borrowed, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more, that Social Security cash. There was a cash buildup for all the baby boomers' retirements that are starting to happen. And I'm a baby boomer myself. And I know Social Security isn't going to be there for me. It just isn't. Not going to be there at all. But the Washington, D.C., the administration borrowed that money. They put these special Treasury bonds in the trust account for Social Security. They took the cash and they spent it. That's where Clinton got his magic federal budget surplus. He was raiding the pension funds of American workers. And he was doing it at a time when we were all being told the economy was doing great. Well, if you're having to borrow money from the people when the economy is great, under what economic circumstances are you able to pay that money back? And the answer is none. The Social Security Trust Fund is filled with a bunch of government IOUs the government cannot honor. They are defaulting on the American worker. The U.S. government is already in default on its credit obligations. They just looked around and said, well, we can't default on the Federal Reserve. They'll lower our credit rating. We can't default on the foreign investors and banks because they'll stop investing and loaning more money. But we can default on the American people because they can't do a thing about it. And so here it comes with all this massive war spending and trillions in bailouts to Wall Street and billions of dollars to Israel. How are they going to lower the budget deficit? They're going to stiff you, the American people. They took all that money from you, from your paychecks, and they spent it someplace else. That's usurpation. That is a point in law. When somebody is given authority over a resource and uses it to a purpose other than that desired by the owners, that is usurpation. Captain Ahab, chasing after Moby Dick when his job was to basically get whale oil for a profit. That's usurpation. It's mentioned in the Declaration of Independence when a long train of abuses and usurpations, because the government of Britain was doing exactly the same thing, taking the money from the American colonists, and instead of spending it on taking care of the colonies, went off and spent it on war. That's where we are right now. And if the government is taking your Social Security money and spending it to purposes other than what you gave them the money to accomplish, that is effectively taxation without representation. We're all the way back in 1775 in terms of the political realities in this country. And I don't want to live in 1775. I'd like to live in the 21st century. But it's already out there. Obama's offer to Congress to try and come up with some kind of a deficit deal is to screw the American workers. You. Every one of you who ever got a paycheck with all the little boxes of deductions, they're stealing from you. As if the taxation itself were not enough, now they're taking your other money that's supposed to be for your retirement. They've spent that, they can't replace it. And that's why they're talking now about forcing you to convert your IRAs and your 401ks and buy and put the money into yet another government-administered retirement program. What makes you think they're going to treat this one any different than they treated Social Security? We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here, coming up on the top of the hour. Now, back in the 1830s, even before the Civil War, and by the way, rule of thumb, if you win it, it's a revolution. If you lose, then it's a civil war. But back in the 1830s, debtors' prisons were abolished in the United States of America. They're back. Thousands of Americans have been sent to jail, not for committing a crime, but for missing a payment on traffic tickets, medical bills, court fees. We're being dragged back to the dark ages by the money junkies here. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Interesting story over at the Internet Post, a tipping point in the financial system. We know one has to be coming. And it's basically going down a list of all these bailouts and fixes that were supposed to save the economy, and things have gotten worse. The current program of fiscal policy is serving the 1% and the 1% only. Now, talking about debtor's prison here, most people understand that if you have an overdraft at your bank and you don't have overdraft protection, which they will sell you for a small fee, you'll get hit with an overdraft fee. And overdraft fees have gone sky high as banks are scrambling for any excuse to take more money from you by any way. And it turns out that last year, consumers paid $32 billion in overdraft fees to the banks. This is a $400 million increase from 2011. Now, many years ago, it was normal policy for banks during the nightly reconciliation run to process the checks against your account before they would process the deposits in order to artificially create overdraft opportunities. So basically that meant during business hours during the day, you would make a deposit to your account, and on that same day, checks that you had written on that deposit would be presented at the bank. And that night, they would process the checks first, so they would bounce, and they could send you a notice. You owe us $45 overdraft fee. And supposedly it ended with a major lawsuit against Bank of America. But given the desperation of the bankers right now, it could very well be happening again. If you're getting overdraft notices, if you think your money is supposed to be in the bank and you're still getting overdraft notices, it may just be as simple as the banks choosing to process the checks against your account ahead of the deposits. Going to take a break when we come back from station identification, talking about Cyprus. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show, and I want to talk a little bit about Cyprus. A lot of people in the aftermath of the haircut, which turned out to be a castration of the Savers accounts over there, were wondering why the people of Cyprus seem to be taking it so calmly. And, of course, Cyprus is one of the countries that puts lots of fluoride in their drinking water, and fluoride is a tranquilizer. It's a key ingredient of Prozac. But it seems that maybe what Cyprus has been dealing with is a sense of numbness in the population. They simply couldn't believe this was going to be done. And now we're seeing stories like this one from, this was over on Yahoo, where numbness gives way to anger in Cyprus over the bailout, especially now that they're being told there's going to be a second one. And they're getting very, very angry, especially because it's come out that good buddies of the president of Cyprus got their money out. For all the talk about the Russian oligarchs, it seems they were able to get their money out. And the government is saying, we're going to have an official investigation, and we will get to the bottom of this eventually, some years down the road. And so the people of Cyprus are getting very, very angry because they want to know what the heck happened. And they're getting a stall from their government. So it could still blow up. Now, over in Italy, the CEO of Unicredit, Federico Ghizzoni, Italy's largest bank, the CEO, is saying that global deposit confiscation is now necessary. That means everywhere, in every nation with a private central bank, they're saying, yes, it's time to start taking the uninsured deposits. And we know why they're talking about the uninsured deposits, because for the insured deposits, if they take the money out, then some other branch of the government has to put it back in, and it's a zero-sum deal. And we're hearing over at 12160.com about something called the OBR plan, which stands for Open Bank Resolution, meaning banks can take your deposited money to keep themselves solvent anywhere. They're really going to do it. And our common sense advice to everybody listening to this show is you should have no more in your bank than you need to cover your outstanding obligations. and you should keep the rest under your own control. Put some of it into silver and gold, physical, not paper, from a reputable dealer, because there's a lot of fraud going on out there. But they're openly talking about a global plan. And remember, it came out. This was discussed last September during the G20. And boy, that sure explains the security they had there. They didn't want anybody inside to hear any of this stuff. This is robbery. There's no other word for it. The Ponzi schemes are collapsing, and these bankers are getting up there in their three-piece suits and their $100,000 watches and say, yes, it's legitimate for us to take your savings accounts to keep our business going a little bit longer. It's just another variation of the theme of we're going to take your money away from you and give it to the banks so the banks can then loan it back to you at interest. Well, if it's your money, why should you have to borrow it and pay interest on it? We could ask that same question about the national currency. It's supposed to be our money. The currency of a nation is a public utility. Why should we pay interest on what is ultimately our own money? Perhaps because of all this backlash here we're hearing over at Poor Richard's blog, there's growing sentiment on Capitol Hill for breaking up these too-big-to-fail banks. More about that when we come back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. So as we were mentioning before we went into the commercial break, there is a growing sentiment on Capitol Hill for breaking up the too-big-to-fail banks. There used to be laws in this country against large monopolies because it was recognized time and time again throughout the nation's history. When corporations get too large, they become very destructive of the society as a whole. They destroy competition. Their monetary power can warp the government and the media to serve whatever the corporate agenda is, whether it's vaccines, global warming, and so forth. And history has shown us just how arrogant and dangerous these money junkies can be, in the form of the attempted fascist coup d'etat against Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. And after Major General Smedley Butler blew the whistle to Roosevelt, Roosevelt wanted to arrest and hang these men for treason. And they simply sat back there in their boardroom office and said, you can't touch us. You touch us, your entire economy will implode. We will see to it. At that point, if the government wants to be in control of this nation, it should have taken control back. But I think many people on Capitol Hill are realizing the money junkies have too much power over our society. And money junkies are not looking out for the society. They're not looking out for you. They're just looking out for themselves. So the political climate is beginning to swing against these. But again, just breaking up the banks isn't going to ultimately solve the problem. Until you get rid of private central banks issuing the public currency as a loan at interest. Now, not very well reported in the American corporate media. They're too busy going on and on about this Rutgers coach who's finally resigned reluctantly for screaming at his kids, and Jodi Arias and Michael Jackson and all the other condensation that we're seeing here. But last week, one of the largest banks in Europe did default on their gold contracts, the paper gold contracts. This is ABN AMRO, the largest Dutch bank in the Eurozone, notified all of their holders of gold delivery contracts, futures contracts, that ABN AMRO could not deliver the physical gold. They just couldn't get it. But not to worry. They were going to pay off those contracts in paper currency equivalent to the current spot value of the metal, because they can just print that stuff up as they go along. Now, this news, in a common sense world where you don't have government manipulation of both the media and the banks, this should have sent gold prices upward. But it didn't. Gold prices went down again. Why? Well, because they're just issuing more of these paper gold contracts, even though we are now in a situation where those contracts will never be delivered in physical metal. They'll just give you more paper money back. over at Investment Watch blog, they have an article about gold's fall being exaggerated. And they're absolutely right. We were commenting earlier in the show that the gold and silver spot price is arrived at by combining the physical market with these paper futures contracts. And that if you broke them out separately, demand and the price for physical is definitely very, very high. And the paper contracts are very, very low. But when you have major money center banks who have been selling these gold futures contracts and they are not able to deliver physical, I don't think their customers are just going to settle for that big, tall pile of pretty printed pieces of paper, because if they were happy with the pretty printed pieces of paper, they wouldn't have been buying a gold futures contract, would they? And I would expect to see that there are going to be lawsuits filed against this Dutch bank for failure to honor the contract. Now, I don't know what the banking laws are like over there. It may be that the bank can simply say, well, yes, we promised you an apple pie, but we're going to just give you a magazine picture of an apple pie instead, and you've got to be happy with that. And the Dutch investors who were buying those gold futures contracts don't have a legal option there. I know here in the United States of America, if you buy a gold futures contract and the person selling you the contract is unable to deliver, oh boy, the lawyers are going to have a field day with that one. And it should be a red warning, flashing light that a gold run is about to kick off. And we have been seeing the signs of this all along. All the tungsten-filled gold bars with hallmarks of American banks and institutions on them. The extreme reluctance by the New York Federal Reserve and the Bank of England and the Bank of France to allow those nations and other banks who have their gold bullion on deposit there to even look at the bullion, let alone count it and do purity tests. And finally, of course, when Germany demanded their gold bullion back, the New York Federal Reserve said, oh, it's going to take us 7-8 years to get it back to you. And Germany's private central bank was saying, oh, yeah, that's fine. We trust the New York Federal Reserve. See, these private central banks, they're not loyal to the nations in which they operate. They're only loyal to each other. And then, of course, Germany asked for their gold bullion back from the Bank of France. And Bank of France said, well, it's going to take us 5 years. And then 1 week later, they invaded Mali, Africa's third largest gold producer. We know that these central banks are trying to buy physical gold. The price should be going up. Obviously, it's being artificially kept down. And at the point where they can't do that any longer, gold is really going to take off. Now's a good time for you to be buying. Because if the bankers are holding the prices down so they can buy physical gold at a low price, it means you can buy physical gold at a low price. They're not going to be able to keep it up much longer. Texas wants their gold back from the New York Federal Reserve. Still have not heard a response from the New York Federal Reserve. They're going to be able to deliver it. By the way, for those of you who are into recycling, here's kind of an interesting story. This came out of silverdoctors.com. It turns out that in discarded electronics, there is more gold in a pound of discarded electronics than in a pound of really good gold ore. Now, we know that a lot of these recycled computers are sent over to third world countries to harvest the gold and other metals out of them in a very toxic, environmentally damaging way. But I think maybe the time has come for somebody in this country to work out a clean and efficient way to reharvest these metals. There's a lot of gold and silver and platinum in your iPhones, your tablets, your smartphones. If you can get your hands on a Tomahawk cruise missile, there's 15 kilograms of silver in those things. We treat our weapons better than we treat our wives in terms of jewelry. Now, we're getting a warning story. This is also out of Silver Doctors about fake silver coins being discovered. American silver eagles that are filled with molybdenum. And you do need to be careful. Now, there's two ways to look at this story. And by the way, these fake American Silver Eagles are slightly underweight, so you want to have one of those little pocket electronic scales with you to see what's going on with that. Now, this report may be more about scaring people away from metals and back into the banks and stock market, but fakery is a real issue. Don't forget those tungsten-filled gold bars that were discovered over there in Germany, which is probably a big reason why Germany wants their gold bullion back, along with getting ready to have a gold-backed Deutschmark when the euro collapses. But there is fakery out there. We know a lot of fake silver dollars are coming from China, and you need to be careful. And that means if you're going to buy physical, you need to go to a reputable dealer who dares not risk their reputation with a fake, which is a sort of a left-handed plug for the Republic Trading Group. If you go to your local flea market, you probably see guys there with the boxes out front of silver dollars and everything that they're selling. That is a high-risk venture, no matter how attractive the price is. Because that dealer can be selling fakes, and he's gone to another flea market the next week, and you can't find them. So you do need to be very, very careful. I still think that storefront gold dealers ought to have a hospital ultrasound right there on the counter so people can look inside those gold bars and see if there are tungsten rods or tungsten blocks or not. Some of the fakes, silvers, are actually using metal, ferrous metals. You can check them with a magnet. If you've got a stack of these silver coins, you run a magnet over there and any of those coins jump up. They're fakes. And again, as they're saying, these molybdenum American Silver Eagle fakes don't weigh the correct amount. So if you're doing a lot of buying and selling of physical yourself, invest in one of those little shirt pocket digital scales and know what the coins are supposed to weigh and check that. Because anytime you're putting a different metal in there with a different density, you're going to get a different weight, and it's a dead giveaway. We have a caller on the line, Shannon in Tennessee. Aloha, Shannon. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, got a question for you about pensions. I'm getting a pension from a former employer, which happens to be the state of North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, do you think eventually they'll raid those deals, or do you think those will just go belly up when the stock market finally does take a dump?
Well, you're very fortunate to be in a pension plan that is still alive, because a lot of pension funds all over the United States were defunded by the mortgage-backed security fraud. Because under law, pension plans can only invest in AAA-rated stocks, and the Wall Street ratings agencies, except for Egan-Jones, the Wall Street rating agencies gave all of these mortgage bundles AAA ratings. Stay on the phone, Shannon. We're going to take some commercial break, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Shannon in Tennessee about pension plans, and I think as a general observation, pension funds all across America are fragile right now. And we have seen in a lot of the states where their state pension funds were heavily invested in these mortgage-backed securities, they're now defunded, and we see the state governors coming out there saying, well, we can't have these teacher and firefighter and police pensions anymore. We just can't afford it, which is basically not addressing the reality that it is Wall Street's criminal fraud that has destroyed the pensions of working Americans. As to the safety and security of any one given pension fund, it depends on their exposure to fraudulent offerings, which is what the ratings agencies were supposed to protect them from and did not. So it's good that your pension fund is still operating, but as the situation deteriorates, we're already seeing these giant too-big-to-fail banks saying we've just got to go out and take money wherever we can find it to keep the banking system healthy and strong. And that's not the sign of a healthy and strong banking system. A healthy and strong, right. And so it's an area of concern.
Well, I will say this, North Carolina, the last time that I checked a couple of years ago, had the second best funded pension plan in the nation, I think, behind Oregon. And as far as their debts to or their funds to obligations, I think they were at about 99% of their projected liabilities. But I just wonder, long term what's going to happen, because I'm getting that, and I'm also on Social Security. And my worst nightmare is, and I'm trying my best to get prepared for it in the event that both of them someday go away, that, I'm not totally, like a duck out of water.
Well, I think more likely than they're simply calling you up and saying we can't send you any more checks, what will happen is the banks will just start printing up more money to fund the pension funds, and you'll still be getting the same amount in that check every month. But as the hyperinflationary effects percolate through society, you will find that that money you thought you could live on really doesn't buy very much. We're seeing it out here in Hawaii. My wife and I go over to Sam's Club. And the prices are just going through the roof on stuff.
Oh, everything's going through the roof here in Tennessee, too. You know, used to I could go to the grocery store for a month, and with frugal shopping, $150 would get me a month's worth of groceries, and I'm finding now that it's taking $300 a month, and which, you know, with the amount of money that I'm getting at the present moment, that's, you know, I can still handle it, but I really can see that at some point in time that 300 might become 500 or 600 or 1,000.
At this point, it's inevitable. At this point, it is inevitable.
Yeah, I don't see any way around, you know, that with all of the money that they're printing and with everything. And I just know that, you know, the funds that I'm getting right now, I do all right, but I can see, you know, years down the road, and probably not that many years, I'm thinking maybe as short as a couple of years, that the money that I'm getting may not be enough, and that's the reason why I'm just about debt-free with the exception of my house and you know, just my monthly utilities and stuff, and I don't plan on getting into any kind of debt, and anybody that gets into any kind of debt nowadays is just a fool.
They are. You know, we're on a credit card-free lifestyle out here. And if you have a house with a decent amount of land around it, you might want to think about starting to put together a vegetable garden. And
I'm going to do that next year. I'm actually got almost 3 acres.
Okay.
Unfortunately, half of it is in a creek bottom, so I can't do nothing with that. But I do have some good room, and I'm also working on getting a wood-burning stove and some other things around here so that if it gets to the point where in the wintertime I can't pay the electric bill, that I can stay warm and not have to worry about it. You know, I might have to cut back on my standard of living, but, you know, if I can keep food and stuff, you know, then I'd be okay.
You might want to think about putting some rice into that creek bed, because rice requires a really moist environment. And
well, I would, but it's rocky. It's just,
yes, okay.
I'm in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and this creek bed there's almost no soil down in there at all. It's just you know, where erosion has worn into the rock, and unfortunately.
Boy, if I were living there, I'd be out back with a gold pan right about now, just seeing what was sifting down out of those mountains.
Well, I tell you what, I may do that next year. I've been thinking about that. That thought has occurred to my mind, and there's a really good creek that this creek runs into that I do know for a fact that there has been some trace amounts of gold has been found in it recently.
Okay, well, there's a good thing. Now, remember, you got to pan on your own property. If you go onto somebody else's property and start panning gold, they might not look too kindly on that. All righty. Well, listen.
All right. Well, I appreciate it, Michael. Thank you very much. I listen every day, and I really do appreciate your insight.
All right. Well, thank you. We got to take a break for commercials, and we will be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And getting back to the economy here, I've had a lot of people constantly emailing me, calling me, haranguing me. Oh, Bitcoin is wonderful. Bitcoin's the future. Everybody's got to be doing Bitcoin. And it has been doing extraordinarily well. But there's a very interesting article that came out of CNBC in which they point out that the reason Bitcoin was climbing in value had to do with a change in the rules regarding Bitcoin mining, which I still think is a crowdsourced public encryption key breaking system. But that's a completely separate situation. Sebastian Gailey, who's the senior currency strategist at, I don't have the name of the bank where he is right now, but basically saying that Bitcoin is showing the typical aggressive behavior associated with a bubble. And I've been saying for days, I'm smelling the tulips on this one. Somebody could convert all their wealth to Bitcoins, drive up the value, sell out, and drop the losses on everybody else. It's a classic pattern. Bitcoin is not doing very well because one of its major exchanges was hacked into, and that led to a massive sell-off, and it's lost about 20% of its value overnight, or its price overnight. I don't know that it has any real value other than what people believe in it, because it's not tied to a recognized commodity. Over in Egypt, their economy is basically going the same direction as everybody else on the planet. They're looking at bread riots or bankruptcy, and I think they ought to go with the bankruptcy, to be very, very honest. Now, I want to talk about all of this haranguing that we are getting on the corporate media about this new flu pandemic over in China, and people are dying, and it's a 1/3 mortality rate, and they're killing all kinds of livestock to try and stem this crisis. And it reminds me very much of the when pigs fly flu scare back in 2009, where our corporate media was saying, you know, this could be the slate wiper, the depopulator. I remember even National Geographic had an article about the coming flu pandemic, and they were showing this little graphic, how many people died from the Spanish flu, which was hideously misnamed because it emerged in the United States of America in a military base. They called it Spanish flu, so people weren't saying, where did it come from anymore? And then they had other earlier flu outbreaks, and then they had a huge bubble that said, this is how many will die unless you run out and you buy vaccines. And, of course, this was just a huge financial windfall for the vaccine manufacturers, who were selling just gobs of this vaccine to governments and institutions around the world, most of which wound up being poured down the sewers after the X dates had expired. And those water treatment plants are not set up to take pharmaceuticals out of it, so people were just drinking this stuff in their tap water. And I reprised a page I put together during that 2009 Booga Booga, which included all these articles about how scientists had been going up and finding frozen bodies that died from Spanish flu. They were recovering the DNA. They were trying to deliberately recreate it. We found these articles about how the CDC was deliberately splicing avian and pig flus together, and then tried to claim that this one that was out there in the wild was an accidental creation. And before you run on out and get that vaccine, it's a given. In another couple of weeks, they're going to be out there, we have a vaccine for this new Chinese whatever it is. You need to remember, back in 1976, there was a swine flu outbreak, and the U.S. government ordered everybody to get a vaccination. Huge financial windfall for the vaccine company. The vaccine killed 50 times as many people as the flu itself did. And as for that pandemic, in 2009, it was a pandemic only because the World Health Organization lowered the threshold for the number of cases to say, oh yes, it's a pandemic, go out and get your vaccinations. And when it was all over, it turned out that this so-called pandemic flu actually killed fewer people than the regular yearly seasonal flu outbreak. It's a big moneymaker. Oh, we've got a new flu, we've got to have a new vaccine. And it's out there. All right, I want to talk about the gun grabbers. They're out there pretty much in high dudgeon. We're getting this very alarming story that over in Colorado, Governor Hickenlooper is about to give the United States Secret Service the authority within the state to arrest any Colorado sheriffs who refuse to enforce federal gun laws. Now, this is incredibly dangerous. This is the beginning of a federal police state, where the Secret Service can go in and arrest a sheriff who says, I will not violate the Second Amendment. And the Secret Service is going to say, you will violate the Second Amendment. We have the orders. Judge Napolitano is out there looking at the new Connecticut gun control laws and saying, this is the wish list for everybody who hates the Second Amendment. The gun grab is on, and it's going to polarize the country. Utah is about to pass a bill that will allow legal concealed carry without a permit It's modeled on the one they used to have in Vermont. I don't know if it's still the case, but not too long ago in Vermont, if you wanted to carry conceal, you pick up the gun, you put it in your pocket, you walk out. No special license required. And needless to say, Vermont has one of the lowest violent crime rates in the entire country. As opposed to Washington, D.C., when they still had their handgun ban before it was struck down by the Supreme Court, and handguns were banned, and they had the highest per capita murder rate in the entire country. The Oklahoma Firearms Freedom Act approved guns exempted from federal rules in a bill that's been passed by the House panel, is now headed for the full legislature. And there's a very interesting article coming out of Poor Richard's blog about why nearly all state gun controls being passed are going to be eventually null and void. And, of course, reason number one is that most of these laws ultimately will be struck down by the United States Supreme Court, because they are violations of the Second Amendment to the Constitution. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be abridged. And the United States Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Miller that the Second Amendment is specifically about weapons currently in use by the U.S. military. If they've got it, the Second Amendment says you have a right to it. And I know that makes a lot of people very nervous when we look at the federal government obviously preparing to go to war against the 50 states. And talking about tyranny and revolution is very upsetting to those Americans who are currently dependent on the federal government for food stamps or a salary. But in a nation where the police do not intercede to protect you from violent crime, very often they're killing innocent people themselves. And with the U.S. government handing out lethal assault weapons, real assault weapons, fully automatic, to the drug criminals in Mexico who then bring them back into the United States, the common sense solution here is we, the American people, have a right to keep and bear arms equal to, if not superior, to the weapons in the hands of the criminals. Nobody has a counter-argument for that. Nobody has a counter-argument for that. And let's see, we got some callers on. Actually, before I go to the callers, there's one other story that I wanted to go on to. The Holmes situation, the Batman movie killing. Apparently, 3 months before this guy went on the shooting rampage, his psychiatrist was trying to sound the warning that he was confessing to her these uncontrollable homicidal thoughts. It has now come out this guy was on a generic equivalent to Zoloft, an SSRI. Once again, we find out the problem is not the guns, it is these medications. He was on Zoloft. And a couple of others. That's the problem. Guns don't cause mass killings any more than cars cause drunk driving. You're dealing with a chemical problem that causes responsible people to act irresponsibly. These so-called antidepressants, ADHD drugs, whatever you want to call them, SSRIs, have a long, well-documented history of triggering extreme violence and suicide in a significant portion of the patients who are on these things. But they're a big money maker, and they go on out there. And before the gun grabbers decided they were going to disarm you so that you can't say no when they come for your savings accounts, Fox News covered this link between SSRIs and violence. Michael Moore is on video admitting these drugs are causing a lot of this violence. But it's now off limits. It's verboten to talk about this subject in the American American corporate media right now. Because those pharmaceutical companies that are making all this money off of this stuff, and now over 10% of the American population are on these drugs. That's 30 million people taking these medications every single month. Huge amounts of money. And the pharmaceutical companies, very generous donations to Congress for congressional campaigns, and Congress did hold hearings on this problem but chose to do nothing because they don't want those campaign checks to go to their opponents. And corporate media won't say anything about it anymore because pharmaceutical companies are a big, big part of the advertising revenue. You see all these commercials on TV. Buy the new whatever it is that'll make your hair curly. And then there's that fast voice at the end saying that if you take this bad things could happen. You could even die. But hey, small risk, small price to pay for feeling really hunky-dory. So now we actually have it. The Batman shooter was on SSRIs. And they may have been making his mental condition far worse instead of better. The pharmacists and the doctors have been brainwashed. This medication will make everything better. And you find out it's actually making it worse. And like I said, I went through this many, many years ago. When my first marriage was breaking apart, and my doctor back then, without my even saying anything about being depressed, said, hey, why don't you try this to deal with the depression and stress of your marital breakup? And I don't even remember which one it was. And I believe the doctor is thinking about what's best for me. I was very naive back then. And for 3 weeks, I felt great. I was fun to be with. And the 4th week, I had an adverse reaction. And I got through it only by saying over and over to myself, this is a chemical problem. I'm not really feeling this way. I'm not really having these thoughts. This is the chemical. All righty, let's see. Back to the phones. Todd in Illinois. Aloha, Todd. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Mike, it's great to talk to you. I've been listening for probably 2 or 3 years. And I just want to tell you, we're getting ready for anything down here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We can't get any bullets around here. No bullets. And we're just prepping up for anything. I don't care what the government thinks about preppers, but we're getting ready. That's all I really got to tell you. But it's really great.
Good for you. Remember what happened after that big storm hit the Northeast, and the joke was, who are the preppers? They're the ones not digging for food in the trash bins.
Right. I got a big supply of eFoods Direct in here. I'm not trying to advertise for them, but that's what I go by, and we're just getting ready. I don't care what the government says, but I can see something's going on.
Yeah.
I can tell something's going on, and I'm not for sure, but today I just got out of debt.
Congratulations.
I did. All my credit
Ben
cards
Bernanke
are paid
hates
off.
you.
My house is paid off. My cars are paid off, and I'm not going to wait for anything to happen to me. And that's all I really got to say. Mike, right. I like listening to you.
Thank you very much.
One of the best radio personalities on the Internet. That's all I got to say.
Thank you very much for those kind words. As a little side note, we're starting to hear about large gun stores starting to set up their own ammunition-making facilities in the back room to meet demand, because the federal government is buying the output of all the dedicated ammunition factories, and to meet public demand, they're starting to set up their own little operations in the back. And if you are a dedicated shooter, you might want to think about setting up a reloading bench. Get your hands on as much surplus brass as you can, because now the federal government used to take leftover brass from military training and sell it to the reloaders. They're not doing that anymore. They're basically crunching it up and melting it and selling it as junk metal. They don't even want you to have the leftover brass. So it might be a good time to set up a reloading bench. And the reality is, if you're a precision shooter, you're going to get more accurate ammunition measuring it out and putting it together yourself than the factory loads. And so it's probably a really good thing. For all of us black powder enthusiasts, of course, we're sort of automatically making our ammunition. It's sort of, wherever we go, get some lead that doesn't have any antimony, get out the bullet mold, and start making bullets. All right, we're going to switch over to Steve in Virginia. Aloha, Steve. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello there. I had a question here. We heard the other day, Alex Jones make a statement about something about attacking North Korea if they were on the verge of really attacking us or launching some kind of an attack over there. And I just wanted to know, I realize, of course, the globalists have twisted the words around of the leader over there, and I think we heard what you had said the other day about being in a dangerous situation, which any normal country would make if provocations continue. And then, of course, the media twisted that around.
Mm-hmm.
But what would you say to that? I mean, do you have any thoughts about what he
Well, the reality is, getting back to the real world, for all of Kim Jong-un's bluff and bluster and over-the-top rhetoric, that was intended for domestic North Korean consumption because he's trying to use this crisis to consolidate his power. You know, forget about the joblessness in the economy and the hunger. We have a foreign enemy threatening us, and the U.S. government does the same thing using Al-Qaeda. The reality is, North Korea does not, in fact, have a deployable nuclear warhead. Their longest-range rocket is the Taepodong-2, which cannot reach Hawaii, certainly not the mainland United States. It can reach Guam and the westernmost Aleutian Islands, depending upon the size of the warhead it's carrying. And the last time they test-fired one, it blew up in flight. So this idea that North Korea was going to nuke the mainland U.S. or they were going to send a nuclear bomb 300 miles up into space to destroy our entire electronic infrastructure, that was so over the top, and I think that's the reason the internal polls seem to be showing the government that nobody's buying this stuff. We got to take a break for commercials. Thank you for the call, Steve. We'll be right back.
Thank you.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're about 5 minutes from the top of the hour where the lovely Lady Claire will be joining us for a portion of hour number 3 here. A lot of people are very concerned about this new United Nations Firearms Treaty and what are its implications. Originally, this was proposed as a means to control cross-border sales of small weapons, but it appears to be rapidly mutating into a general population disarmament bill. Originally, it was this will control drug criminals, it'll control warlords, pirates, terrorists from acquiring deadly arms, and now it's rapidly mutating into a civilian disarmament program. And we know why they're doing it. Because the global banking cartel is already talking about taking your savings out of the bank to save themselves. And they don't want you to be able to stand up and say, no, don't do that. If they succeed in taking your guns, they're going to come back for your savings accounts. They're going to come back for your gold, for your silver, for anything of tangible value that they can put on their balance sheets. And then they're going to come back for your sons and daughters to go out and conquer those few remaining nations who refuse to see what a blessing private central banking, issuing the public currency as a loaned interest, is for all mankind. Beretta is going to leave Maryland. All these states that are passing these gun grabber bills, they're seeing a loss of business and a loss of jobs. As I was mentioning to that earlier caller, ammunition is flying off the store shelves. You need to start acquiring what you can and building up a stockpile, even if you're just target shooting or you're hunting, you're not doing anything criminal or even revolutionary. If you want to go on shooting, you need to make sure you have a supply of ammunition. Think about a reloading bench. A lot of the larger gun stores are setting up their own ammunition manufacturing. And that's very, very practical. Toward the end of World War II, when the Allies were bombing the large munition factories in Germany, ammunition making became a cottage industry. People were just doing it in their homes, working at home, just loading powder and shells and running the bullet press, and just selling the ammunition out their front door. I think we're going to start seeing more of that happening here in the United States of America. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Aurora Theater shooting, the psychiatrist who was treating James Holmes tried to report that he was confiding in her that he was getting these uncontrollable homicidal thoughts. And she reported it. Dr. Lynn Fenton told a police officer that Holmes was saying these things, and nothing was done until 38 days later when he shot and killed 12 people in that theater. And as I mentioned, it has been confirmed James Holmes was on sertraline, which is a generic version of Zoloft, the same thing one of the Columbine killers was on. We'll be right back. Aloha, America, and for those of you watching over Justin TV, this gorgeous creature sitting behind me is the lovely Lady Claire, who joins us every Friday in the third hour with her unique perspective on what's going on in the world. What's first on your list?
Well, first on the list is apparently Exxon believes that having faulty plants means never having to say you're sorry, because not only are they having the horrendous problem in Arkansas right now with that spill from the Canadian crude, there is...
Oh, remember, that's not crude oil. That's
bitumen.
Liquefied
Yes.
bitumen, and
Yes.
it's not oil, so Exxon doesn't have to pay into the oil cleanup fund.
Of course not.
Okay, remember, we're being politically correct here. It's not really oil. It's
Right.
just sticky, smelly, flammable black
Gooey,
stuff,
yeah.
but it's not oil.
Yeah.
So, okay.
And so what they've had has been a fresh chemical leak at a refinery in Chalmette, Louisiana. According to the New Orleans Times-Picayune, residents of the New Orleans suburb began reporting strong odor of burning tires and oil to the local Coast Guard on Wednesday. And the claims soon appeared to be backed up by the Exxon Mobil refinery the same day. Confusion remained, though, about what chemicals and the types of chemicals were dumped as a result of a break in the pipeline connecting to a drum used for storing liquid flare condensate with flare. And at oil refineries, flares are gas combustion devices generally used to burn off flammable gas released by pressure relief valves.
You see them in every refinery. It's that big flame that's up there high in the sky. That's where they're burning off these flammable components that don't have any commercial value.
And among the chemicals that was released, benzene.
Ooh, that is not good. Benzene is an engraved invitation to leukemia.
Yeah, it's a known carcinogen, and whoever allowed the plant to lapse into this kind of state should be jailed. Should be jailed for a long period of time and not at a club fed. I mean, this is just ridiculous neglect.
It is, and we're already seeing how the U.S. government has turned a blind eye to all of this thing, whether it's the Deepwater Horizon or Bernie Madoff, San Onofre. All of these disasters are happening because the money junkies are in control, not only of their own corporations, but of our government.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we know how dangerous these refineries can be, the materials, the chemicals they're working with. And if we're seeing this kind of a high failure rate, and I understand ExxonMobil is trying as hard as they can to keep this out of the TV news,
Yep.
because this is simply building public opposition to the Keystone Project.
Right.
And again, you know, it's all about we need a pipeline, we've got to get more oil, we've got to do all the gas stuff. And we're seeing these horrible environmental disasters. And a reminder that ExxonMobil was able to use its influence to get the Federal Aviation Administration to declare a no-fly zone over the spill in Arkansas. And even more to the point, ExxonMobil is in control of it. They say how far it is, how high it is, and how long it's going to be.
And of course they've been greasing the palms on both sides of the aisle for so long.
It's not grease, it's liquefied bitumen.
You know, I would almost be willing to bet real money that there will be no prosecution in these cases. The Zimbabwe dollar.
Yes.
Yes. No, I would not.
There are never prosecutions.
Yeah.
Nobody got prosecuted for the British petroleum disaster
No.
in the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody got prosecuted over the very underhanded actions out at San Onofre that led to that disaster out there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what corporate law is supposed to do. A corporation, the corporate officers are protected against normal business failings and accidents, but corporate law does not protect them against criminal action. Unfortunately, what we've seen on Wall Street appears to spread throughout our entire corporate culture. Above a certain level, you are never arrested no matter what you do. Remember when Bayer was selling that hemophilia medication?
Yes.
Contaminated with the
Yes.
AIDS virus?
Yes.
Nobody at Bayer got arrested for that. We'll be right back after these commercials. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with the lovely lady Claire, and you wanted to talk about Korea.
And some developments there. As most of our readers and listeners know, the Pentagon announced on Wednesday it is deploying one of its newest ground-based missile defense to the U.S. island of Guam in the coming weeks. And if Kim Jong-un conducts a missile flight test, that will be a provocation that the U.S. government is going to use as the excuse for a preemptive strike against North Korea and ultimately China.
Well, we already know the corporate TV news is making a big deal over the fact that 2 of North Korea's medium-range missiles, not the long-range ones, medium-range, have been sent over to the East Coast. Now, this is not a signal of impending attack. It looks to me like it's a military test, a demonstration, and these rockets cannot reach Guam. So this theater high-altitude air defense system that the U.S. has deployed there is not going to have an opportunity to shoot these rockets down.
Right.
On the other hand, the Aegis ships that the U.S. has off the coast of North Korea could intercept that test. But if North Korea has issued the appropriate international warnings for a test, like the U.S. Navy did before the accidental shoot-down of TW-800, then North Korea is within their legal rights to conduct military tests. They're issuing a warning saying, we're shooting live-fire tests into this area, you're best stay out of that, and if the U.S. goes in there anyway and shoots down the rocket, the U.S. is going to be seen as the aggressor and the provoker.
And the real problem with this is that China is treaty bound to defend North Korea should it be attacked. And it was reported.
Well, I'm laughing because look how many treaties the United States government has broken recently, including the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty with regard to Iran. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty has been pretty much dusted by all of this ballistic missile defense.
But, sweetheart, we're dealing with Asia. And one of the worst things that can happen in the minds and eyes of Chinese leadership is to, quote-unquote, lose face because they have not kept up with their promise. And
I would have to disagree with you slightly. I understand that face and honor is very important, but when you're talking about a nation that knows it does not want to go to war with the United States of America, I'm expecting China to take the position that, well, North Korea got into this mess all by itself and they're going to have to clean it up for themselves. That, of course, would pull the entire rug out from under the U.S. agenda for provoking North Korea. And, you know, China understands that would probably cool things down quite a bit. If the U.S. all of a sudden realized they can't get their desired conflict with China through North Korea, they might back off North Korea.
That would be hopeful. And an anonymous U.S. official was quoted as saying, we're not on the brink of war with North Korea. But if what this person said is actually true, Mike, I don't think they'd have a problem being sourced or quoted, would you? If it was really true?
Well, in a general sense, yes, but I would imagine, remember, within the hierarchy of the government, there are designated people to speak to the press.
Right.
And if you are not that person, you can get into trouble.
Yeah.
And, of course, Washington, D.C. leaks like a tea strainer anyway, and usually it's anonymous. And this, I tend to think this is a planted piece of propaganda because, remember, last night we saw on CNN where the U.S. is toning down the rhetoric and they're pulling back. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, what I interpret this to mean is the internal overnight polling is showing that the American people certainly do not want yet another war. They don't want to go back into Korea. And they see the United States as the belligerent party that has provoked this whole crisis with sanctions and saber-rattling and B-2 stealths and B-52s and warships off the coast of North Korea. And that's why the U.S. is trying to back off so that they can sort of come back a little bit further down the road and say, oh, North Korea is doing this with thus and such. But I think they've already blown their credibility on this one.
And there's been another development. Apparently, the North Korean government, and pardon me, you've been saying that they've been telling diplomats to get out. Now the North Korean government is saying that it will not be able to guarantee the safety of embassies from April 10th, which is next Wednesday. Now, the Russians are playing this very cagily, you know, as the great chess players they are. They've been advised to evacuate, and apparently they are examining the suggestion, but the embassy is working quite as normal with no problems. So the Russians are saying maybe not.
Well, again, while the corporate TV news is trying to imply that North Korea is threatening all these foreign diplomats, what North Korea is really saying to them is, we are concerned that the United States is going to preemptively attack our capital.
Right.
And we don't know how accurate their weapons are, because lately U.S. weapons are very inaccurate. And for your own safety, you might want to think about being just a little further away from the target zone. And that's all that North Korea is really saying. I don't know why they set a date of April 10th or if that was something that was creatively added in the translation.
It could have been, as you and I both know, the devil is in the details with translations between Korean and English.
Well, we already know that a week ago today, the corporate media was saying that North Korea had declared a state of war exists with South Korea. Then, of course, on Monday, it was revealed, well, yeah, that was a mistranslation. Golly shuckies, we're trying to do our best, but Korean is such a difficult language to learn. And it's very reminiscent of the still repeated claim that Ahmadinejad said he was going to wipe Israel off the map, which is not what he said at all.
There's no idiom for that in Farsi to begin with.
Yeah, what he actually said is Israel, of its own fault, will vanish from the pages of history. And I tend to agree with his analysis, but that's a far cry from saying we're going to wipe them off the map. And again, Iran has not invaded another country in a war of aggression in over 200 years. It's not their nature.
And the other thing is the talks apparently concluded very well with Iran and the P5+1 today, and in Kazakhstan. And, nobody walked out, nobody sulked. And if given the opportunity, I do believe that these talks can lead to concrete, intelligent agreement if the warmongers don't get their way.
Well, again, we were reporting earlier in the show where parties all across the whole P5+1 were saying, let's pull back on the sanctions as a show of good faith, and then Iran will come back and possibly do something in reciprocity. The U.S. position, of course, has always been, and it's a bad habit they got from Israel, you give us everything we want first, then we'll decide if we'll give you anything in return. And, of course, that's a negotiating posture that is designed to fail.
Right.
So we'll see who prevails there, but we can count on the United States to somehow overtly or covertly try to once again derail any possibility of a peaceful resolution of this crisis, which is solely on the side of Israel and the United States. They're the only ones saying, oh, Iran can't have nuclear weapons. They're 3 months away from a nuclear bomb, and they've been saying that since 1985.
Yeah, it's been a long, wrong litany of what's going on. And to date, to the best of my understanding, no IAEA inspection has demonstrated that any nuclear material, Mike, has been diverted from its peaceful energy program toward a nuclear weapons program.
Well, Amarno's propaganda position is, well, just because we haven't found anything doesn't mean they're not hiding it from us, which, if you think about it, he's basically admitting that the IAEA can't really do its job, because its job is to find evidence of nuclear weapons development. And if he is saying we can't do it and we're not convinced that it's not there, then it's time to basically fire the IAEA. We need to get Mohammed al-Baradei back. He was objective and honest about what was going on.
Absolutely, and a gentleman on top of that.
Yes.
Yeah, it does seem to be, though, a war between the U.S. economic system just collapsing completely and a world war.
That's exactly what it is. And every time this Ponzi scheme banking system gets onto the verge of collapse, they get out of it with a world war. Crash of 1907, World War I. Crash of 1929, World War II. Crash of 2008, the United States has already invaded more than 10 countries on 2 continents.
Yep.
Technically, under U.S. military doctrine, it is already a world war. What they're waiting for, what they're trying to come up with, is a really big bang where ordinary people will wake up and say, oh, yeah, it isn't just a bunch of separate little conflicts, it's a world war. We have to forget all about the banker predations and government corruption and all the cruelty and the torture. We've got to stand behind the flag because now it's a world war. I don't think it's going to work this time, but I think that is exactly what Washington, D.C. Is trying to do.
And the problem is that the U.S. does not have the capability to win a conventional war.
Well, the bankers who are behind this, they don't care. The bankers love war. They don't care which side wins because both sides go into debt to fight the war, and then both sides go further into debt to rebuild after the war. And when this horrible process is over, the ordinary working people have kind of sort of what they had before, except the graveyards are a lot bigger, and they're back on the debt hook to the bankers for another 50 to 100 years.
I think in the film The Fifth Element, it was referred to by the bad guy as creative destruction.
Yeah, the broken window analogy. And, the idea we've got to create a need, we've got defense contractors, we need a war to build business. And it is a very, very sick, psychotic way to run a nation. But again, when the money junkies are in charge, they're not thinking about human life. They're not thinking about the betterment of society or even making progress. It's all about churning up your children in a giant grinding machine, out of which comes gold coins for their pockets. Look at the history of all these banker-instigated wars for the last 230-odd years. More than 100 million human beings have suffered cruel, violent, horrible, painful deaths, and the bankers just say it's the cost of doing business to keep the little Ponzi scheme going for another generation.
Absolutely.
Okay, we got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. I was just taking a quick look at the stock market, and despite the best efforts of the plunge protection team in those last 30 minutes here, they didn't quite massage it up to the traditional Friday happy ending. And I'm sure that's going to be weighing on the minds of investors through the weekend. You had some economic news that you wanted to share with us.
Well, I wanted to talk and share with our listeners and viewers about how the criminal banking cartel is destroying this country. And the reason I make that observation is that the U.S. government has openly conceded that its sovereign authority to enforce its laws is gone when Attorney General Eric Holder testified that the Justice Department's failure to prosecute any big banks is based on anonymous, quote-unquote, expert opinions that prosecutions would destabilize the financial systems.
Like it's stable now?
Yeah, right. If it turns out that these, quote-unquote, experts are in fact agents of the big banks whose crimes are being immunized by the very entities who discredited opinions the DOJ is relying on, then those opinions are nothing more than assertions of criminal sovereign immunity, a privilege that is legally limited to the President of the United States.
And I don't think even he should have it in this day and age
no.
here. Now listen, common sense is going to tell you, if a bank committed a crime, and you take the executive who authorized that, for example, Jamie Dimon, who they've got emails saying he approved one of the big scams, throw him in jail. How is that going to directly affect the U.S. economy? It isn't.
No, it won't.
What they're talking about is a threat by the bankers to intentionally crash the economy in retaliation for any prosecution. And again, this is exactly why back in the 1930s, when the Wall Street bankers tried to stage a fascist coup d'etat against Roosevelt and they got caught, Roosevelt was unable to prosecute them for treason, which is what they were engaged in, because they simply sat back there and said, you arrest one of us, we will deliberately, intentionally crash the economy. And had the United States government really been thinking about the long-term future of the nation, they would have started taking those large banks apart at that time. The banks are not supposed to be above the law. We understand they think they are. We've got Alan Greenspan on video saying the Federal Reserve answers to no federal government authority. They just do whatever they think is going to make them the most money, and you're just supposed to sit there and take it because that's what makes America great.
Well, what that demonstrates, at least right now in this country's history, is that we have several tiers of so-called justice in this country. One is for the very well-connected and moneyed, who can buy the dream team defense attorneys who can continue to keep them out of trouble.
Or bribe their way out of prison. I mean, they're going to let Jeff Skilling from Enron. He had a 24-year sentence. They're going to let him out now.
Yeah. And then you've got the very poor who are stuck with public defenders who, many times because of horrific workloads, don't know anything about the charges that have been brought against their client until the moment they walk through the doors of the courtroom on the day the trial is held. And, of course, under these circumstances, the poor are far more apt to be convicted because they have everything working against them.
Well, it goes even worse than that, because in the case of these giant bankers, with the sole exception of Bernie Madoff, who got thrown in jail because he was cheating his fellow Jewish investors, but all these people behind the mortgage-backed security fraud, the LIBOR rigging, they haven't even been arrested. They don't even have to worry about a lawyer.
No.
They're not getting the perp walk. They're tossing some lower level clerks, out there for the masses to scream for blood. But these top level executives, they're not being arrested. They don't need to worry about lawyers.
Nope.
They understand they are immune because they have the power to destroy the nation overnight.
Yep.
And that is really a power bankers should not be allowed to have.
No.
Again, and I said this earlier in the show, the only way to save the United States of America as it is right now, without having to go through collapse and rebuild, without having to go through a violent revolution, is to move to instantaneously shut down the Federal Reserve, write off the debt, and break up the banks, to be done very quickly. I'm descended from a Knights Templar in my family, and I used to be very upset about the way that King Philip the Fair, was bad to my ancestors. But having come to understand how the Templars' banking practices plunged Europe into unpayable debt, I'm starting to realize that my ancestors didn't get half the kicking around they deserved. And Philip the Fair was right to do what he did, and we need a new Philip the Fair to declare the bankers guilty of heresy or whatever it is they're going to do, and throw them in the dungeon and just write off that debt. We need the Iceland solution here. We need the Andrew Jackson solution here, and nothing less will serve.
Absolutely. It's really, really frustrating to see what these people are allowed to get away with absolute impunity.
Yeah, it is amazing. But again, as they start stealing more and more money from the people of the world, and they're doing it openly now, they're going after your savings account. As long as they tithe the politicians with a piece of the action, the politicians will look the other way. Even though he got thrown in jail, Bernie Madoff went for 12 years with his Ponzi scheme, and the SEC looked the other way. And now, of course, Madoff has come out that all these big Wall Street banks knew that's what he was doing. But since they were making money off of him, they looked the other way.
They kept their mouths shut.
All right, got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And it's sort of a conventional wisdom in news management that the really bad things are going to happen very late on a Friday so that nobody really can comment about them until Monday, and by then it's usually old news. CNN is out there screaming about hidden missiles and heavy rhetoric coming from North Korea. They have 2 missiles loaded. And, of course, we talked about this earlier in the show. These are medium-range missiles that can't reach anything connected with the United States of America. It looks like North Korea is going to conduct a test/demonstration. And apparently, over at the White House, their spokesman, Jay Carney, is saying the U.S. would not be surprised if North Korea launches a missile. Yeah, in a test or demonstration, we're not going to be surprised. If North Korea is seriously thinking about an attack on anybody, it's going to be more than one missile. One missile is not a provocation. But already they're ramping back up. They've pulled back from the U.S. belligerents. And apparently they don't feel they have the luxury of being able to wait too long to go back and say, it's all North Korea's fault. And we've been hearing that over and over again. It's all Afghanistan's fault that we had to invade them. It's all Iraq's fault we had to invade them. It's all the Sudan's fault we had to invade them. It's all Pakistan's fault that we have to send in cruise missiles, or rather drones, and kill innocent people. It's all Yemen's fault that we have to go in there. It's all the Congo's fault. It's Libya's fault. We have heard this time and time and time again. If you are a nation, if you are the head of a nation, and if your political power is not too solid, if you don't have good approval numbers, you are forced to respond when a foreign nation starts flying their latest weapons over your borders and have warships parked off your coast. Remember, Roosevelt did this to Japan. Roosevelt wanted to get the United States into the war against Nazi Germany to help out his good buddy Stalin, who was not doing very well at the time. And Roosevelt had the U.S. Navy attack German shipping in the North Atlantic in the hope that Germany would declare war or at least respond in a fashion that the U.S. could say, oh, Germany has attacked us, let's go to war. Adolf Hitler didn't respond. He knew it was a provocation, and Hitler knew he did not want to go to war against the United States of America because the United States of America had an industrial base equal to that of Germany at the time. And so Roosevelt went to Plan B. As soon as Germany and Italy and Japan signed the Axis Agreement, Roosevelt said, if we can get into a war with Japan, then by default we will be at war with Nazi Germany. And so he took this 8-step plan written by Office of Naval Intelligence Lieutenant Commander Arthur H. McCollum. And they started implementing it at the end of 1940, step by step by step, things designed to really tick off the Japanese leadership. And it included sailing warships right off the Japanese coast in a show of force. And after a while you do these things, the government of that nation, whether it's Japan or North Korea, because of the issue of face, they have to respond because of political pressure from their own population. And that's what the U.S. is clearly counting on. Yes, Kim Jong-un is flapping his yap more than we would ever like, but we understand that's for internal consumption within North Korea itself to bolster his political reputation, to increase solidarity among the population during very hard times they're having over there. Kim Jong-un cannot back down from the U.S. provocations without risking being removed from power. That's the situation where he is. So they're now trying to turn this possible military test firing, live fire exercise demonstration into a provocation. Oh my goodness, North Korea launched a rocket into the Pacific Ocean. How dare they do that? Think of the dolphins and the whales they're killing. Or some other such lame excuse. So they're back to just pounding on this rhetoric just as hard as they can. Alrighty, we got a caller on the line, Anonymous in Texas. Thank you for waiting, and what's on your mind today?
Well, hi, Mike and Miss Claire. Something really important. I just tuned in, so I don't know if you have covered this yet in the show. But I have a very long-term friend, very close friend that works in the psychiatric office.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, it's not unheard of for them to have patients that threaten suicide or have suicidal tendencies, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And patients they've been seeing over the last few years, all of a sudden this week they've had a rash in actual attempted suicide with their patients.
Yes.
Now, please follow my train of thought here. We got fake gold bars. We've got fake silver coins. They're watering down my beer and my tequila, which really made me mad. Now, what are the pharmaceutical companies doing with these psychotropic drugs? That these same patients have been taking the same drugs for a year and a half, and now all of a sudden a percentage of them actually tried to commit suicide in 1 week. What is going on?
Well, it could very well be that in an era where there's no government oversight on this, that they're starting to basically cut the active ingredients in these medications to save a few bucks. I mean, the FDA
That's what I'm thinking, exactly, sir.
And when you are withdrawing from these SSRIs is when you are most at risk for taking your own life or shooting up a local movie theater.
Well, I just had to throw that at you on a Friday. I mean, it disturbs me greatly knowing this person actually works in the office. You know,
yeah.
I'm worried for their safety, and somebody smarter than me, maybe a chemist or someone, can maybe look into that. I know you have a wide listening audience there.
Well,
so, anyway,
it's entirely possible, and it would be nice if we had an independent testing authority that was testing medications for full potency and efficacy. But again, that's supposed to be the FDA. But these days, the FDA just takes the word of pharmaceutical companies. It's completely without oversight.
I found it quite frightening that the patients they've been seeing for like over 2 years, all of a sudden in 1 week, a percentage of them actually act on their threats of suicide.
Yeah. I think one of the most interesting stories, if you go over to ssristories.com, and they have all these thousands and thousands of case studies, and the one that really leapt out at me was a young person who had been prescribed these SSRIs for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which when I was younger we called daydreaming because teachers boring the crap out of me.
Yeah.
And this kid just tried to commit suicide. They got to him in time when it was all over, and they said, "Why'd you try and kill yourself?" And he says, "I don't know. It just popped into my head, and I went with it, and I don't know. I didn't have a reason. It just happened."
Well, I'll tell you, I don't know what the world's coming to, Mike, but you're doing a great job at opening everyone's eyes.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I just hope they get open early enough and soon enough. And now that we have this confirmation that James Holmes was on an SSRI at the time when he was telling his shrink, "I'm getting these uncontrollable homicidal feelings," and she told the police, and the police did nothing about it. It's not an issue until he uses one of those evil guns to commit a newsworthy mass murder.
Yeah, that's like when you get threats from your neighbor and the cops tell you, well, we can't do anything until he actually acts on the threat.
Oh, don't get me started about that. We're dealing with that situation ourselves.
Oh,
all righty.
Well, I'm sorry, Mike. Well,
yeah.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Have yourself a good weekend. Now then, getting back to the gun grabbers, Dianne Feinstein, apparently realizing that she's not getting the traction with gun bans that she was hoping, is now getting her 15 minutes of fame by saying it's time to go after video games. Video games are teaching our children violence. And she's basically citing the fact that Adam Lanza was a fan of Call of Duty and StarCraft. And I understand these are big, successful games. I don't play them myself. I'm not a big computer game fan outside of flight simulators. But we also understand that the blame for inspiration for violence, when you subtract out the chemical aspect, and we know Adam Lanza was on Fanapt, an antipsychotic, and the manufacturer says can provoke incredible bouts of unreasonable rage, paranoia, and anxiety. It's on the little slip of paper inside the medical case, the box that it comes in. They're admitting this stuff is doing this. And Feinstein saying, oh, it's the video games. Well, listen, what is the lesson that young people today are getting from the federal government? The solution to all your problems is to bomb somebody or shoot them, because that's what the United States government has been doing to solve their problems for pretty much going on, well, since 2003, if not before. We have a whole generation of young people who've really grown up during this period of unremitting war. And if you want to blame the video games, yeah, maybe it's a factor. But look at what they're seeing every night on the corporate TV news. We have a problem with Libya having a state bank and a gold dinar. Kill them! Bomb them! Take it over! Iraq wants to sell their oil for euros. Kill them! Bomb them! Take them over! Iran is selling their oil for international currencies and they refuse a private central bank. Kill them! Bomb them! Take them over! If you're a kid growing up in a climate like that and all of a sudden somebody ticks you off, what's the first thing that's going to pop into your head? Kill them! Bomb them! Take them over! If Feinstein wants to look at a non-pharmaceutical cause for all of this violence in our society, she ought to look into a mirror, because it is the U.S. government that is setting the standard of behavior. Rivero's rule of mass morals is that any organized hierarchical structure is going to inherit the manners and morals of those at the very top. And when you have a political leadership whose solution to every crisis is to send in the drones and the soldiers and the bombs and the B-2s and the B-52s, how do you think kids are going to grow up thinking that's an acceptable solution? Do what I say or I will kill you, because this president I'm being told I must admire in the schools, that's his solution. But Feinstein wants to demonize the computer gaming industry. That's going to backflash on her. And you know why? Because California has a lot of companies that make these computer games. And they are not going to be happy at being demonized. Now, the corporate news is making a big deal over the fact that Obama made a comment about California Attorney General Kamala D. Harris. He was at a San Francisco fundraiser, and he started out saying she's brilliant, she's dedicated, she's tough, she's what you would want as an Attorney General. And then he parenthetically added, she also happens to be the best-looking Attorney General in the country. And the feminazis went nuclear on this. And they're trying to make a big deal about how dare you comment on her looks, you sexist pig, you. Now, longtime readers and longtime listeners know I am no fan of Obama. In fact, I have not been a fan of anybody that's been in the White House since John F. Kennedy. But in this case, my criticism falls on those feminazis who have seemed to have thought that complimenting a woman on her looks in a nation where fashion and cosmetics are multi-billion-dollar businesses is something we men are no longer supposed to do. Of course, women comment on each other's looks all the time. And nobody's saying, oh, it's sexist or it's anything else. But when you men, you comment on women's looks, you're being sexist, male chauvinist piggies. Now, philosophically, I don't support the fashion and cosmetics industries. I think all of you women out there are beautiful just the way the universe made you, and you don't need all this paint and powder and so forth. But back when I was dating pre-Claire, I learned the hard way that if you did not compliment a woman's looks after she spent 3 hours at the hairstylist, you were going to go home alone that night. And that's just the reality. Now, I also know that the feminists out there whining the loudest about this so-called sexism of admiring a woman's beauty usually are the ones you wouldn't compliment anyway, even with 15 pounds of paint and powder applied with a sandblaster. Now, the situation was quite different in Europe when I worked on some film projects there. It was very refreshing. Women there get upset at you if you don't compliment their looks. They get angry and unhappy if you're not flirting with them. And any male neglecting to do so in the workplace does so at his own peril. Important pieces of paper suddenly start going missing. And, of course, being able to flirt and talk and be friendly made for a friendlier and more fun office studio environment. But friendly and fun are banned under feminism's desire to portray any admiring male as a potential rapist, to scare women into buying magazine subscriptions and tuning into daily talk shows that scream about all the evil things men do, get them into political rallies, get them to write checks. The reality is, when you're my age, and you look the way I do, admiring a beautiful woman is kind of like reading National Geographic. You see a beautiful, exotic location you don't actually plan on ever visiting. And somebody put up an article the other day, is feminism becoming a bad word? And today it is. Now, when feminism started, it was all about equal pay for equal work, equal access to education, equal access to credit. These were all very laudable situations. But then the movement got hijacked, taken away from equity feminism to gender feminism. And there's a book out called Who Stole Feminism by Christine Hoff Sommers. And she lays it out how what was originally supposed to be about fairness and equality for all was turned into this constant male bashing, all men are rapists hysteria that just demonized men and presumed women were supposed to naturally be entitled to superior positions in finance, culture, and society and politics. And so feminism today is very much a problem. We got a caller on the line. Matt in Texas, going to have to go fast. What's on your mind?
Yeah, Mike, great show. Listened to for a while. One of your better shows today.
Thank you.
You brought up JFK and Lincoln. Which those are pretty obvious, but few people ever mention Zachary Taylor and Garfield. I think if you look into their assassination attempts, you might find some interesting information there. But what I was actually going to ask you about was, since you've worked on...
You're going to have to hold for the commercial break. Don't hang up. Matt, we're going to come back. You're our last phone call for the day. We'll get back to you after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, welcome back to the last segment of our show today before we get into the weekend here. We're talking with Matt in Texas, and you were saying something about film production.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've worked on Star Trek, you've worked on Lost. I was wondering, if you were ever interested in, making your own documentary or something to reach out to more people. You seem to be one of the more awake and intelligent individuals. You put out a lot of material. I think you're making more people, awakened and informed. But this is just a specific, demographic that you're reaching with the radio show. I just think, you might be able to reach out to more people with like a documentary film,
Well, we're starting to go in that direction over the last couple of years, and this is partly an outgrowth of the facilities that I built when I was still in the film and TV industry. We do have a production capacity, and we're working out the kinks in the production workflow with these videos that we're doing around my wife's music. But we are looking at doing some longer form videos to put out on YouTube to address certain issues. We've already done one about this local Feeding the Hungry program and going into the schools for the food insecure children, because the food stamp money is only good for the first 3 weeks of every month, and these kids are going hungry the last month. So we're starting to do that. It's just always a case of time and resources. But we do have the equipment. We're just, looking for a good topic. I'm not going to do a documentary about myself because I'm the only person who would watch it, and maybe then I wouldn't even do that. I'm very bored by my own story. But we are looking at doing that and trying to get some stuff out there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I know it's basically more to ask out of you and whatnot, but I just think that kind of like a great work, or whatever, that it's something you can concentratedly put out, really awaken people and, just information packed,
Well, I think one of the reasons I've avoided doing the long, drawn-out documentary productions is because events are moving so fast that by the time you do a very long documentary on a subject, it's very often past the point where people need to be paying attention to what's going on. And working in the blogosphere and short form, you're able to get these points out there while they're still timely. But I'd like to do some longer-form documentaries, definitely. I mean, in my ideal world, after the bankers are gone and we're safe from World War III, I'd love to be doing nature films and travelogues, to be very honest. Again, there's only so much, Michael, to go around. That's why I walked away from film and TV. I was in the middle of Off the Map, and it just reached a point where I couldn't do the website and the talk radio and film and TV, and I had to make a choice, and that was the choice I made. Okay?
Okay, thanks for taking the call.
All right. Well, thank you for the very, very kind words. And, we're working. We're able to master Blu-ray discs and all the rest of that stuff now. So we're definitely getting all of our ducks in a row towards doing some longer-form work in the very, very near future. Always takes funding. You got to hire people. You got to do all that stuff. And so cash flow is always going to be a major issue. So anyway, let's see. All right, there's the music. I guess I'm done with the show today, and I'll have to save the rest of these talking points for Monday. In particular, some interesting information has surfaced about the motivation behind this Monsanto Protection Act and why it was rushed through. And it has to do with viral DNA inside all those GMO crops. We're going to head on out of here and get something useful done with the afternoon. Until Monday, stay safe, stay informed. Share what you know with who you know. Please support Republic Broadcasting. Please support What Really Happened. We do not get gobs of corporate funding, which means we also don't have to do what the corporations tell us to do in our programming choices to you. So have a good weekend. Be safe. Aloha, America.